In this video, we're going to talk about the circular flow model. The circular flow model consists of two main parts, the first of which being the physical flow, and the second one is the economic flow. What is a physical flow? The physical flow is the flow of goods and services. So, we defined production in the last video, and we talked about the production is combining factors of production in order to produce products. Well, this is a continual process, and it is actually the continual process of transforming these factors of production into final goods and services, or into products. So, we have the producers. What is the producer's role in the physical flow? Well, what producers do is they buy these factors of production. Remember, they need these factors of production to transform them into products. So producers, these guys right here in this diagram, they buy these factors of production. And we can see that right here on this diagram. The factors of production are actually going into the producer box. And then the producers turn around and they sell these final goods and services. We can see that by the arrows pointing up. So they buy these factors of production and sell final goods and services. What is a consumer's role in the physical flow? Well, the consumer, what they're doing is they're buying these final goods and services. So they buy the final goods and services from the producers. But at the same time, the consumers turn around and sell their factors of production. So the consumers are selling their land, labor, and capital to the producers in order to buy final goods and services from them. So, an example of a complete physical flow circle. Let's say, for example, we have a consumer who is a coal miner. An individual consumer who is a coal miner, what do they provide? They might provide their labor. So they sell their factors of production, which is their labor. It goes into these producers. The producers, which is the coal mine, produces coal. So coal, is it an intermediate or a final good? Well, in this case, we're going to call it an intermediate good. So these producers produce this intermediate good. It goes over into this box, and then that becomes an ingredient. Remember, they pump that intermediate good, which is this coal, back over to another producer who is, say, the energy plant using coal. Well, they go ahead and produce energy out of it. That energy is now the final good or service, or the final good that is going to be used up. So that goes up here. And who's going to be buying that energy? Well, it's the coal miner. So we have this complete circle right here. That the coal miner provides his labor to produce the coal that he ultimately consumes later on. And that shows the complete circle of the physical flow. And what's interesting to note is that the sides match. For a producer to produce a final good or service, we must have a consumer willing to provide a factor of production. And if one side, let's say the consumers decided we're not going to provide our factors of production, so we're not going to provide our labor, then the producers cannot produce anything because they don't have the factors of production. But at the same token, the consumers want these final goods and services. And the producers really can't produce final goods and services unless the consumers are willing to buy them, and the consumers aren't willing or really can't buy unless they sell their factors of production. So what's interesting to see is that these sides match, and if one side is prospering, the other side is prospering. If one side is failing, the other side is failing as well. Let's say that the producer side isn't doing so hot. Well, what do? They lay off workers, and now the consumer side is being hurt because they can no longer buy these final goods and services. But let's say, for example, the consumers are being hurt, or the consumers are facing high prices elsewhere, and they really can't provide these factors of services like they normally can. Or say the population decreases to the point where there just isn't enough workers to provide their factors of production. Well, now the producers are hurt. So if one side is hurt, the other side will ultimately be hurt as well. But if one side or the other is prospering, the other side will prosper as well. The next aspect of the circular flow model is the economic flow. What we're going to find out is that the economic flow is the monetary counterpart to the physical flow. So in the physical flow, we talked about final goods and services and factors of production. And on this side, we're going to be talking about expenditures and factor payments, which we see right here and right here. So what are expenditures? These are payments for goods and services. So we have final goods and services going that way, but at the same token, for a consumer to be able to obtain a final good or service, they have to pay for it, right? Well, that's called an expenditure. An expenditure is payment for final goods and services. So we see consumers paying expenditures to producers for final goods and services. And we also have the factor payments. So factor payments are payments for factor services. Over here we talked about factors of production. Right here, for a consumer to provide their factor of production or their factor service, they need to receive some kind of factor earnings. So some payment for their labor, some payment for their management skills, some kind of payment for their land. So we see that factor payments are payments for factor services. Now, if we look down here, we have the producers providing factor earnings to consumers. The consumers are providing expenditures to producers. So we have this circular flow again, just like we saw over here. But if you notice, the arrows right here went counterclockwise, whereas these are going clockwise. That'll be something to note for a little bit later. So what we need to know is that factor earnings are used by consumers for expenditures. So if you go and work somewhere, you're getting paid for your labor. That's your factor earnings. What do you do with that money after you get paid for it? Or you get paid? Turn around and go out and buy something, right? You buy a final good or a service. So what happens is we have factor earnings are being used for expenditures. But at the same token, these producers, they get paid these expenditures, but they turn around and they use these expenditures, this revenue that they're getting, to cover their costs, or the factors of production costs, these factor earnings. So we see factor earnings are used for expenditures. And we see that expenditures paid to producers are used by producers for factor earnings. So what we come to realize is that both sides are dependent upon each other. The producers need the consumers in order to receive these expenditures so they can pay out the factor earnings. But at the same token, the consumers need the producers in order to earn these factor earnings so they can buy things by these expenditures. So both sides are highly dependent upon each other. Consumers and producers are highly dependent upon each other, and no one could survive without the other. This now leads us into the basic principle of the circular flow model. And what we find is in the basic principle, we combine the physical and economical flow. We've already talked about the physical flow and the economical flow. Now what we're doing is we're combining them together. And previously we talked about the physical flow as if they were its own separate thing. Economical flow is its own separate entity. And all of these individual transactions that are taking place over here look at like a single transaction, and that's it. When in reality, when we dive down, we see that the physical flow and the economical flow are basically two sides of a single transaction. So whenever we make final goods and services, and a producer is producing a final good or service and selling that to a consumer, for them to sell that final good or service, they have to receive an expenditure. So just like we saw over here, final goods and services went to consumer, expenditures went back to the producer. Well, this happens simultaneously. It's not two separate deals, but it's just two sides of a single coin. Producers receive the expenditures, and at the same time, they fork over that final good or service. Down here, we see that producers receive factors of production only if they are willing to pay factor earnings. So now we're seeing that for one thing to happen, we see that another must happen. So we create this complete circle where we say, well, if there's no pay, there's no work. So for consumers, if they were to sit back and say, we are only going to provide our factors of production only if we receive factor earnings. So if they say no pay, no work. Well, what's the common response to that? Producers are going to say, no work, no pay. And what we find is that we have this complete circle that for producers to produce final goods and services, they must receive receive factors of production. And the only way they receive factors of production is if they pay factor earnings. Consumers, they want to buy these final goods and services, and the only way for them to buy final goods and services is to pay these expenditures. So what we see is that this is the economic and the physical flow that's happening simultaneously at the same time. This leads into the last aspect of the circular flow model, and that is the equality between the physical value and the economical value of goods and services or of factors of production that are being traded. So we've already said under the basic principle that you're only going to trade your goods and services for expenditures. And you're only going to trade your factor earnings or your factors of production for factor earnings. Well, these need to be equal in value, and these need to be equal in value before you'll ever make a deal, before you'll ever trade. So let's say you're going out to buy a bag of oranges. So you're the consumer and you're buying it from a producer. So you are paying your expenditures to a producer and you're receiving a final good or service, or you're receiving the oranges. So you're only going to make that transaction if the price is right, right? You're not going to buy a bag of oranges for $10 whenever the market price is $2.50. Well, what determines that market price? Well, it's said in the word, it's market. So what we have to do is we have to establish physical and economical value and make sure that they're equal for these transactions to occur. This is done through free markets. If you remember back to chapter 3, we talked about free markets, and in the absence of coercion, then we wind up finding that every transaction is a win-win. And if prices are too high, then by the invisible hand, the prices begin to come down, because if prices are too high, we start finding out that there is a surplus of products and it pushes prices back down. Or if there's a shortage, we see that prices rise, and that these prices fluctuate based off of these free markets. And this is exactly what's happening here as well. So we find that equality is established in free markets, and that a market is a two-dimensional aspect. It has prices and quantities. Well, that's the economic flow and the physical flow. So we see that markets are now beginning to come into play through the economic and the physical flow that we're talking about in the circular flow model. So we have two main types of markets within the circular flow model. The first one is this physical market, and it is the market for final goods and services. And it's this particular graph right here. So what is a market for a final good or service? Well, that's where the prices are established for final goods and services, where the equality is found between the expenditures that you're paying for that final good and service and the value of that final good and service. So this is where they begin to equalize out. These are your typical markets, like a farmer's market or a supermarket or anything like that. It's at this place that we start affecting prices based off of the supply and demand relationships and where that equilibrium price actually comes out to be. So we have the physical market, which is this chart right here, that is the market for all final goods and services, where the economic value and the physical value of these final goods and services are equalized. Then the second market is the factor market. The factor market is where these factor services, the value of these factor services, equal the factor earnings, or whether it goes into mesh in order to where you now can equalize factor earnings and factors of production, or in the value of these two. And this is known as the factor market, which we see down here. This is where employment numbers and wages are really established. So have you ever stopped and thought about why do you get paid what you get paid? Why is that wage set at that? Well, it might be because it's minimum wage, but it might also be you're earning a lot more than minimum wage. Well, if you're earning more than minimum wage, why is that wage set up in that way? Well, because you have the skills and the knowledge to be able to perform that job. Well, if there's less amount of people that are able to perform the same job that you are, then your wages are going to go up because the supply is less. Or let's say that there's a large demand for your particular job and you get paid a lot more because of that demand. Well, now we're seeing that supply and demand is starting to affect how much you actually get paid. So whenever we actually look at this graph, we see that consumers put their expenditures in here and producers put their final goods and services back into this market. And we have the demand for these final goods and services from the consumers, and we have the supply from the producers, and then it goes into this market, this the physical market, to determine the prices of final goods and services. Then down here we have consumers who are supplying factor services. We have producers who are demanding these factor services and are willing to pay factor earnings. And where the supply and demand intersect is where we begin to find out what the wage is for that job and what the unemployment or the employment numbers for this job is. So this pretty much completes the circular flow model. And the one thing to really take out of this is that the economic and the physical value of any transaction is going to equal and is going to be completely equal in a free market without any coercion. And that another thing to really notice is that within the physical and the economical flow, it's basically two sides of the same coin. Just like we see here, we have expenditures and final goods. We have factors of production and factor earnings. These are two sides of a same transaction. And that for producers to prosper, consumers must prosper. And for consumers to prosper, producers must prosper. And if one of these sides begins to fail or decline, both sides will begin to fail or decline.